Welcome to Learning Objective 3 for Chapter 24, where we're going to look at the components of the gross domestic product. And so the first thing I would like to do is to share my screen with you. So let me go ahead and do that. Share screen, and here we are. So let me share my screen. Okay, so we're going to look at the components of the gross domestic product in this particular lecture. So here are the components of the gross domestic product. So we have consumption, which you can think of as households buying and selling. Investment, which you can think of investment as those things that would be inventories. Also, new household construction would go into investment. Government purchases, which we'll talk about, and then net exports. So GDP, which we will call Y because it is dependent upon consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So let's get into these a little bit more to see exactly what they are. So the first one is consumption, and consumption is the biggest of all of the components of the gross domestic product. So consumption would be things like spending on anything that you and I as households buy. So again, going back to the circular flow of the economy, we talked about households, and it's anything that we buy in terms of goods, tangible, or services, intangible. Now, what's interesting is it excludes the purchase of new housing. And the reason is because new housing is considered an investment. So it's going to go in our next category. Okay. But if you have an old house, okay, now I don't mean a centennial house or anything like that. If you have a used house, certainly that should be included in GDP. And it is, but it's kind of strange how we include it. So for renters, it's really simple. We're just going to use your rent payment. But for people who own their home, I moved into my home it was built in the 1970s, okay, portions of it. And we didn't buy it until 2003. So I have an old home. And for my old home, what we're going to do to include that in 2003 GDP is we're going to use what we call the owner imputed rental value. So what would a house like mine rent for in this location? So that takes into consideration things like the cost of living in different places and so on. Again, it's not the purchase price and it's not mortgage payments that we put into GDP. Okay. The next one is investment. And investment is things that we spend on businesses, might be a structure. So you can kind of see the land component there, right? Equipment, that would be capital. Okay. And intellectual property. Things like residential capital, again, an apartment building, because that would be more like a land kind of thing. And homeowner's personal residence, if it is a new home, only if it's new. Also, anything that was produced in a time period, but was unsold. So remember when we talked in our last objective, I said, what if we're in quarter one and we have $3 million of inventories that aren't sold in quarter two? Well, how does that work? Anything that's unsold, like let's say we sold 2 million, so that would be in consumption, but there's $1 million left. That $1 million would then go into the investment category in GDP. Okay. Now, this is really important. You're going to see this a lot in our course. Investment really does not mean stocks, bonds, those things. What investment means is that, as you can see, we have land and capital. And many times those are considered investments, not simply stocks and bonds. In this course, I will differentiate the two by saying things like, okay, this is financial investment. So that way you'll easily know financial investments, stocks, bonds, those kinds of things, mutual funds, or I will say investment. An investment would be things like capital, underlying assets of a business or of a person. We're even going to see later on in our course. So let me continue sharing my screen with you. I find it's better if I talk out loud while I do things so I don't forget what I was doing. Okay. Government purchases is another aspect of the gross domestic product. Government purchases mean anything from your local government all the way up to the federal government. Most people don't really stop and think about all of the things that their local government provides, like police, all of those kinds of things. So again, don't forget about your local level of government. You might have elected officials in your local levels, which may or may not be paid, but things like fire, roads, all of those. So that's a lot, when you think about it. And again, culminating at the state and then at the federal. One thing that's not included, okay, that we're not going to include is transfer payments. Transfer payments are those payments where there's not a exchange of labor for some type of compensation. I'm not going to say wages because that would totally be the compensation portion of that. But basically, if you have a person who is perhaps disabled, they are getting compensation for the government, but they are not giving any labor to the government. So compensation, when we have it from the federal, state, local, wherever, is not considered part of the gross domestic product in the government expenditures category. At this point, what I want to do is to show you a little bit of the components, because I think sometimes as a student, I used to think this myself, as a student, you wonder, okay, are they just making this stuff up? What does that really mean? And so let me go ahead and just kind of see if this will work. Okay, you don't want to do that for me. Why not? Let's see. Okay, I don't want any ink. I just want, here we go, arrow automatic. Okay, here we go. Let's try it. So here is, we're going to skip that. Here is the gross domestic product. And this is the, again, Federal Reserve Economic Database. Notice that here's for quarter 2, 1, and quarter 2 of 2022. Here you can see the personal consumption expenditures. If you wanted to use the drop-down arrow, you can see, again, the goods and services. So those match up really nicely. Private domestic investment category, right? So we can look at residential and non-residential. Here's exports and imports. Here's government consumption. Kind of interesting, again, state and local. Look at that. The largest portion of that. So if you're interested in those categories, you can always go to the Federal Reserve Economic Database and take a look at those things. I always find it fascinating. But then again, I'm a geek, and so geeks like to look at data. All right, so let me see where we were at here. Somewhere. We'll find it. Share. Okay. There we go. Okay. So here your author gives you 2021 components and what percentage of those components. What I'd like you to take away from here basically is consumption is the largest in 2021, tied with investment and government expenditures. Notice net exports fell by 4%. So what that tells us, and what our next net exports are going to be, and I want to get back to my pen here. So let me do that real quick. Net exports are going to be everything in our country that we export or sell to other countries. So if it's made in the US, sold to another country, that's going to be an export. Import is everything we buy from another country. Okay, so if we have Italy over here, if we buy any Italian goods, then it's going to be an import. Net exports is actually equal to exports, everything we sell to other countries, minus everything we import from other countries. So when I said just a moment ago it fell, it didn't really fall. What this tells me, this negative portion, it tells me that we imported more than we exported. So imports were greater than exports, which means that we have a trade deficit. Okay. All right, let's take a look at some of these examples just to make sure that you understand what would be affected and how. So Jazeera spends $300 to buy her husband dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston. So think about the components of GDP. I'll write them up here again. Remember, GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. Okay, so she is spending $300. So if you said that consumption would increase $300, by default, then GDP would increase by $300 because what we do to one side of the equation, we have to do to the other. And that's the answer there, that GDP would increase by $300. Okay, let me write these up here again. So remember, GDP equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. Nyla spends $1,200 on a new smartphone to use in her publishing business. The smartphone was built in China. Here in problems, if they tell you where it was built, you can guess that it is an import. So this is going to be an import from China. So let's just take that one first. So an import from China, we know that that's going to affect net exports, which is equal to our exports minus our imports. And so she spends $1,200 on a new smartphone. So imports are going to increase $1,200, which is going to then, by default, make net exports decrease by $1,200. So we know for sure that net exports are going to go down by $1,200. Now let's look at the other portion of this. To use in her publishing business. Now, it's not consumption because she's using it as a business asset. So if you're thinking, that sounds like capital, you're right. And so capital for a business is going to be part of the investment category, and that's going to increase by $1,200. The net effect to GDP is going to be nothing. Okay. All right, let's take a look at the next one. Joseph spends $800 on a tablet to use in his editing business. Okay, so again, very similar to the last one. That sounds like an investment to me. Okay, he got last year's model on sale. Ooh, last year's model on sale for a great price from a local manufacturer. Okay, so again, kind of going back to what we know, GDP, consumption, investment, government expenditures plus net exports. Okay, now if you're saying, okay, let's see, he got last year's model. All right, last year's model, we know unsold inventories are part of investment. And so he's going to buy last year's model. So we're going to subtract $800 from inventories because it's sitting there and then he bought it. He's also using this in his editing business. So we're going to add $800 here, and we're going to say the net effect to GDP is nothing. Okay. Now, there's another way you could do this if you wanted to. You could just say, hey, last year's model not counted. End of story. But if you want to see specifically which components of GDP are impacted, then you can see it from that perspective, the first one. All right, let's look at the last one. GM builds 500 million worth of cars, but consumers only buy 400 million worth of them. So again, GDP equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. Okay, GM builds 500 million worth of cars. All right, consumption, to me, 470. So if you're thinking consumption 470, you're absolutely correct. Okay, but they built 500 million, which means they have unsold inventory of 500 less 470, which is going to be 30 million. And so the net effect to GDP is an increase of 500 million. I should have made that more clear that they were all increases. Okay, hopefully those make sense. If not, let me know, because I'm always happy to talk through them with you. Okay, how did we do? Looks like we got that right. We got that right. Yay, team. And let's see, GM. Oh, you know it. All right, you rock. All right, so that's the end of this particular learning objective. We're going to come back in the next one. I know I said I was going to talk about net national product, but I'm actually going to save that for our fourth objective. So again, any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. So you all have a great day, and I'll see you back in the next objective. Thanks.